Vicky Coriel here, founder and creator of the Low Carb Challenge. If you feel confused, overwhelmed, frustrated, or anxious when it comes to your nutrition, believe me, you are not alone, but you are certainly in the right place. My goal over the next few weeks is to empower you, putting you back in control of your diet and, more importantly, your life as a whole. The purpose of this video today is to provide you with some context and background in regards to the world of nutrition and how the recommendations of mainstream nutrition came about in the first place. I hope that by the end of this video, you feel even more confident and determined to push through with the Low Carb Challenge and give it a red hot go. So to begin with, we're going to go through a short history of the dietary guidelines and chronic disease. If you've checked out my profile, you will know that after a number of years of practicing as a dietitian, I actually left the profession, frustrated by the lack of results I saw with current guidelines and even embarrassed to continue to make recommendations to my patients that I did not believe in. My passion for nutrition, however, never waned, and I set off on a research quest to discover the truth. My research led me on somewhat of a trail. Looking back, lifestyle diseases were extremely rare 2 centuries ago. In particular, metabolic disease, which is so common today and consists of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and PCOS. There was very little recorded in regards to this. Now we know that these diseases are the number 1 cause of mortality and morbidity, so death and disease today. We begin to see this steady rise that corresponds to the Industrial Revolution. And you can see on this graph, there's just this steady rise, but then all of a sudden, we see this dramatic increase in obesity rates. And we see similar patterns with diabetes. And when does this happen? This happens in approximately 1980. So we see this sudden rise in obesity in 1980, and we see a somewhat more gradual, but then again, a big rise a little bit later on when it comes to diabetes. And so the question that you ask yourself is, what happened? What happened in 1980 that this occurred? The first answer to this is something called the McGovern Report. So I don't know if you're familiar with this report and how it was put together, but you can actually jump onto YouTube and there's video footage of a bunch of politicians sitting around a table discussing what is best for the nation in terms of dietary recommendations. And I'll say that again, it's a bunch of politicians that were sitting around the table. And their discussion is very much around and taking into consideration what is going to be good for the nation in terms of agriculture and the meat and livestock industry and the food industry as a whole. There were a number of scientists who were on this advisory board. However, they were all sacked since their recommendations, which were indeed based on science, didn't align with what the US Senate really wanted to recommend to the US population. That to me is just extraordinary. Instead, what they did was they went on a search for a scientist who would align and be able to back their recommendations. And who was this guy? That was him. And his face was on the cover of Time magazine when he came out with all of this stuff. His name was Ancel Keys. He is described as being, influential, a bit of a charismatic sort of guy. And he presented what he called his 6-country study. And what the 6-country study showed was that there was a direct relationship between fat intake and heart disease. Importantly, this is exactly what the US Senate wanted to hear, because this aligned with what they wanted to recommend. Based on this study and taking into consideration the food industry, the first ever dietary guidelines were released to America in surprise, surprise, 1980. And then, shortly after that, they came to Australia and also to the UK. And hence the food pyramid was born, with recommendations to reduce fat and cholesterol intake and increase starch and fibre. It's interesting though that when you go back and you really look at the literature, you will see that although Ancel Keys presented his 6-country study to the US Senate, it wasn't really like that at all. In fact, it was actually a 22-country study. And this paints a very different picture, particularly when we cherry-pick data for ourselves and just randomly put countries together. We can get a very different picture, as you can see in these few slides. We can get a completely different outcome if we choose different studies, different countries. And so what is clear is that Ancel Keys cherry-picked the countries that he wanted to get the result that the Senate was after. So subsequently, there have been several massive scale studies in an attempt to retroactively prove this theory that Ancel Keys came up. So numerous people over the years have attempted to come up with the same findings that Ancel Keys came up with. Thousands, millions of dollars have been spent, and hundreds and thousands of people have been involved in these studies. And the outcome? There has been no evidence ever to support an association between dietary fat or cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So we've never ever been able to reproduce what Ancel Keys was claiming. In more recent times, there have been some meta-analyses done. And for those of you who are unclear of what a meta-analysis is, it's taking a whole lot of studies that have been done over many different years by different teams and putting them all together to see what the average outcome is from all of them. So there was a meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it concluded that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. There we go. And another in the British Medical Journal in just 2015 concluded dietary recommendations were introduced for 220 million US citizens and 56 million UK citizens, and then of course Australia a bit later on as well. And that's occurred all by 1993 in the absence of any supporting evidence from randomized control trials. So all of this is pretty alarming to me. And if this is the first time you are hearing anything in this regard, then probably pretty alarming to you too. And the question here is, well, where did we go wrong? How did we allow for all of this to come about? And what were the consequences? Well, one of the big consequences was this development of the fear of fat. And there is no literature to support the theory that, one, fat makes us fat. In fact, multiple studies have shown better weight loss outcomes for those following low carbohydrate, high fat diets compared to low fat. And two, fat in our diet relating to increased cholesterol, which in turn clogs our artery and increases our risk of coronary heart disease or any sort of heart disease. Well, there's no reason to fear fat on that behalf either, because we have excellent and extensive studies in which it is shown that a low carbohydrate, high fat diet reverses all coronary risk factors more effectively than a low fat diet does. So that's the first place we went really wrong. The second one is we have this notion that carbohydrates are essential and should provide at least 60% of daily energy intake. Yet, humans have no essential requirement for carbohydrates. We don't need carbohydrates at all, in fact. There are zilch deficiency diseases that relate to not having carbohydrates. There are, of course, many deficiency diseases if we don't have enough fat and we don't have enough protein. These are essential in our diet, but carbohydrate is simply not. And the last one where we went really, really wrong is this dramatic overprescribing of grains and cereals. And this, as we now know, was very much driven from a political standpoint to try and prop up food industry. And over the years, this has gotten worse and worse. There are now many papers and many books that have been written describing these areas in detail. And possibly the best book that I have come across is this one, The Big Fat Surprise. Nina, who is the author of this book, is an investigative journalist who spent the better part of 10 years researching the content for this book, and she provides all the evidence really carefully laid out in these pages to support the lower carbohydrate, higher fat approach. And as you can read on your screen there, the advice that comes out of this book is that a higher fat diet is almost assuredly healthier than one low in fat and high in carbohydrate. The most rigorous science now supports this statement. And another statement from her book, in the end, what we believe to be true, our conventional wisdom, is really nothing more than 60 years of misconceived nutritional research. So if we got it so wrong, what is the alternative? What should we be doing? And this is where the hormonal model of obesity comes into play. Now, this was actually first described in the early 1940s, a long time before we got ourselves into this nutritional mess, but was then forgotten. And the premise of this model is that consumption of carbohydrate plus what we call here grazing, or you might think of it as snacking or having lots of smaller, more frequent meals, those two things in combination result in continuous and excessive secretion of this hormone insulin. Now, insulin is something that we will discuss in detail through the low carb challenge, and you will become more and more familiar with this hormone insulin. Now, the importance of this insulin, of the hormone insulin, and what it does is this. Number one, Insulin is a storage hormone. More specifically, it is a fat storage hormone. And therefore, excess secretion results in fat being pushed into storage. We also have limited stores in our muscles and our liver for glucose, which is the end product of eating carbohydrates. And therefore, any excess carbohydrate that we eat will also be converted into fat and stored. And it's all as a result of this excessive secretion of insulin. So when we eat carbohydrates and we eat often, we have too much insulin, which causes us to store more fat. The second important thing to recognize here is that over time, in those who are genetically predisposed, and we say that, but then, it appears that a very large percentage of our population is genetically predisposed. When we have these raised insulin levels, we then get this insulin resistance that sets in. And what happens, as you can see in this little diagram on your screen, we have this vicious cycle that then gets set into place. So we continue to eat carbohydrate, we continue to have small frequent meals, we continue to oversecrete insulin. Because we're oversecreting insulin, we become insulin resistant. But then when we're insulin resistant, we have to secrete more insulin. And what occurs is this vicious cycle that is very difficult to get ourselves out of. Now, when we understand insulin resistance in greater detail, we can begin to individualize dietary recommendations. What we know is that a spectrum exists, and if you are genetically predisposed to insulin resistance, then your tolerance of carbohydrate is really low. In fact, we say that you are intolerant of carbohydrates, and therefore the only way to reduce your weight and to minimize the risk of developing lifestyle diseases is to significantly reduce carbohydrate from your diet. Now, how we determine who is insulin resistant and who is more insulin sensitive, or where you sit on this spectrum, is a very complicated exercise. I refer to it as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. We need to look at a range of physical and genetic markers. We need to look at things like family history, your weight history, where your weight is sitting now, your lifestyle, blood markers, the presence or absence of disease. There's so many variables to determine whether you are insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. And all of these clues are really like trying to put all the different pieces of a puzzle together to get this picture of what an individual's resistance or sensitivity looks like. And getting this entirely right, we can never just bang get it right. It involves a lot of trial and error. And that is a big part of what we need to be open to in order to find the best way of eating for each of us as individuals. But when we do understand the degree of insulin resistance, we can closely estimate the amount of carbohydrate that each particular individual should have in order to achieve their healthiest weight and also reduce the risk of developing a lifestyle disease. So in this diagram, we can see that for someone who is moderately insulin resistant, their weight would sit within a healthy or ideal BMI. So below 25. Even with carbohydrate at around 350 grams per day. Now that is a massive amount of carbohydrate to have on a daily basis. It's more than the average Australian who is just following standard dietary guidelines is having. But for somebody who has this degree of resistance, or it's a real sensitivity, they can get away with eating a lot more carbohydrate. So this is for somebody who really doesn't need to worry too much about reducing carbohydrate. If we compare this to somebody who is markedly insulin resistant, and that's sort of the middle line here, well, already there is a big difference between these two people. And this person would need to keep their carbs at around 80 grams or less in order for them to sit in a healthy or an ideal weight range. So you can follow that line and then go up from the amount of carbohydrate, and you can see when that middle line crosses into the ideal weight category, it's roughly at about 80 grams of carbohydrate. And then, you could do that for each of these individuals to get an idea of where the person needs to be dependent on their degree of insulin resistance. But of course, it is first understanding where you sit on this spectrum. So really, this diagram is just pointing out how different we can be as individuals and how this all needs to be taken into account for best results. So let's summarize what we've spoken about in this video today. First of all, we should not be fearing fat. Do not fear fat. The next one is to limit carbohydrates. And we need to limit carbohydrates according to our own individual degree of insulin resistance. Now, initially going fairly low, or very low indeed, and then finding a realistic and acceptable level via trial and error is the way to go. And this is the way that we do it in the low carb challenge. We reduce carbohydrates right down, and then over time, I will be teaching you how to bring your carbs back up and find the level that is best for you as an individual. The third thing is that intermittent fasting can be extremely useful. Even if we just went to something as simple as 3 meals a day with no snacks. Remember, it was carbohydrate in combination with grazing, snacking, small frequent meals that was causing all the issues. The fourth thing, and this is something that I will emphasize more as we go along, more and more, is that we want to just eat real food. We want to minimize processed food as much as possible. Food that is available to us in nature should be the essence of our diets. And the last thing is support. We need support because this is very different to what most of us have been doing for the majority of our lives. So the support is essential. Having a community of like-minded people on a journey together. And again, this is what you will have access to through the Facebook group during the low carb challenge. So make sure you use that support in there. And that sums up everything for today. Look out for the next video where we'll go into a little bit more of this background information to set you up to get started. See you next time.